Trump rallied voters in Georgia yesterday to support Republican Congressman Mike Collins' campaign for U.S. Senate. But Trump spent time seeming again to mock affordability, label Democrats as communists, as well as trash Collins' opponent, Democratic incumbent Senator Jon Ossoff.
Jon Ossoff and the Democrat communists want to let the Marxists into power, bankrupt your families, and leave you totally undefended with wide open borders. But we will not let that happen to our country. We're not going to let it happen. I fought Ossoff before, as you know, and we won. We had a great success against this guy. He reminds me of Pinky Herman. Did you ever see Pinky Herman? The radical left is actively trying to destroy our children's future with the disaster known as communism. It's communism. This isn't a social democrat. These are communists by another name, right? As I said in my recent address at Mount Rushmore recently, I don't know if anybody saw it, such a beautiful place. You know, the communists want to take it down. They try taking Mount Rushmore down. They want to blow it up. They want to take it down. They shouldn't be up there. These people are crazy. But communism is, in my opinion, communism is the single greatest threat to our country. When I inherited this thing on January 20th, we had the highest inflation in many, many years, 48 years, they say. I say maybe ever. This is what I inherited. And when I had nothing to do with it. What are you going to do about the prices? And they said, they used the word, first time I heard it, it was a word, you know, made up by the Democrats. Affordability. They said, affordability. I said, I've been here one day. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. And we're taking care of it.
So let's provide some fact checks. First, when President Trump took office, inflation was at 3%, much lower than the pandemic high of 9.1%. And while numbers did take a small dip last month, inflation has actually gone up since the start of Trump's second term, now at 3.5%. And John Hammond, two other fact checks. One, Democrats did not invent the word affordability. And two, the character's name is Pee Wee Herman.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a moment, but I also think we could fact check the notion that anybody's really said or proposed or even suggested that Mount Rushmore should be taken down or blown up. I'm not. I'd like to see.
I'm not aware of that.
I'd like to see the person that Trump is referring to there before I'll accept even a rhetorical flourish on that subject. Pinky Herman.
Pinky Herman.
Pinky Herman. I'm telling you, man, the Trump fall off in the nickname game has gotten really pronounced. Marjorie Taylor Brown was the first sign of it.
Not good.
Democrats.
Worse.
And then, you know, he's not yet, I think, said it on camera, but his name for Jon Ossoff, who's, I guess somebody warned him off this, but, you know, it was an unpleasant thing to say about somebody. But he said, called him the other day John Oss, then in parentheses, jerk off. Oss, jerk off. I mean, that's just clumsy. Yeah. Look, that race, which was for Democrats in the Senate. You looked at the map, the two races that they thought were concerned about. They had 6 basically races where they thought they might be able to get a pickup. 2 where they thought they could maybe lose a blue seat. One is Michigan. That primary still hasn't happened. August 4th, there's a lot of concern about that, a lot of focus on it. Georgia was the other one that a year ago you would have saw the Democrats were concerned. But the combination of Jon Ossoff's strength, financial strength, and his strength as a performer, as a political performer, in combination with the fact that Georgia Republicans decided to go with Donald Trump's candidate, Mike Collins, rather than the governor's candidate there, they ended up with the far less electable nominee on the Republican side of Mike Collins. And I think everyone, it's not that it's safe, but I think a lot of the level of concern among Democrats about losing Georgia now is much reduced from how it was a year ago. It's really now the only race they really worry about losing a seat in is that Michigan seat.
Yeah, you're right about the nicknames. We're a long way from Lyin' Ted.
Oh.
And you're right about how the Democrats here suddenly feel much better about this race. In fact, so much so, and Ossoff is so hot right now, people people are thinking about him in 2028 as well as possible.
What a fundraising juggernaut. Been really strong on the stump. I mean, Jon Ossoff's really been, in the way that Gavin Newsom really broke through at a really good 2025, Jon Ossoff is having a very good 2026 for his future political aspirations.
Completely agree with that. John Hyman, thank you so much. We'll see you again soon. Let's now bring in senior writer at The Dispatch and columnist at Bloomberg Opinion, David Drucker. David, let's talk about Georgia and everything John Hyman just said here. First of all, I don't think Trump really helped anybody last night, again, mocking the idea of affordability. But the dynamics are here where it's, Georgia's a state that at times has been willing to defy him. Republicans in that state willing to defy him. They kept Kemp, they kept Raffensperger for a while. Trump took some losses there. But this time around, they are going with his candidate. And frankly, Democrats like the matchup.
Yeah, they really do. Mike Collins is just not the kind of Republican that is going to play well in the Atlanta suburbs. And when you look at a county map of Georgia and you look at where Democratic votes are, but also where swing votes, independent votes, soft Republicans, there's this circle around downtown Atlanta that, for the last 20 years I've been covering national politics. That circle of blue has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I expect this race to be close at the end of the day. But Jon Ossoff has really matured as a campaigner. I think the president, I suppose when he said I've beaten Ossoff, because he didn't in that Senate race after the 2020 election, he may have been referring to that first campaign Jon Ossoff ran during Trump's first term when he ran for a House seat in a special election, and he lost that seat. He was a really sort of stilted wooden campaigner in that race. He's really matured. He's got a message. He repeats it. It's something that people understand and that people like. And, of course, the president's doing him all sorts of favors by continuing to mock the #1 issue voters care about, Jonathan, and that's affordability.
Yeah, and we have seen poll after poll suggest that the economy is going to be a central issue. And those polls aren't good for Trump and Republicans, nor is this new one yesterday from Fox News. In it, it's a brand new one, voters say Democrats are doing a better job on the issues of income inequality, health care, inflation, the economy, and foreign policy. It's a lot. Republicans do hold the advantage on crime and national security, although those are pretty closely divided. And yet, when it comes to immigration, Trump's signature issue, Republicans had an 8-point edge just a few months ago. But today, Democrats are preferred there as well. Meanwhile, 76% of those polled see the economy as only fair or poor, while just 24% say it's excellent or good. Meanwhile, 68% of Democrats say they're extremely motivated to vote in November. That's an 11-point edge on the percentage of Republicans who say the same. Let's bring in Politics Bureau Chief and Senior Political Columnist at Politico, Jonathan Martin. J. Mart, good to see you. Let's start with that enthusiasm answer. I mean, it's not surprising, considering how, in the eyes of Trump's base, or at least portions of his base, he's disappointed them in terms of his promises to fix the economy. He's disappointed them in his promises to avoid foreign wars as the Iran conflict continues to rage. And for some, he disappointed them in not being transparent in handling of the Epstein files. So Democrats are fired up right now, and that enthusiasm gap could play a big difference in November.
I'd add one more element, John. He hasn't forged the kind of legislative record or offered the sort of proposals for his final 2 years that may give some grist to his party for wanting to show up. I mean, if you think about it, the biggest bill that he's signed so far this year is one he wouldn't even sign, which was the housing legislation that the Congress passed. That he was so angry about the SAVE Act, he wouldn't even sign it. It still became law. Other than that, they're running on an extension of the 2017 tax cuts that they extended last year. And there's not much else besides, obviously, calling the Democrats extremist or communist, as Trump says. So he's not giving his base much in terms of what he's done. He's not proposing a lot to give them a reason to show up, to give members of Congress 2 more years or 6 more years for senators. And there's just this trend, John, as you know well from covering it for a decade, in which when Trump is not himself on the ballot, Democrats tend to do better because they show up with anti-Trump enthusiasm, and those who are Trump enthusiasts don't show up without his name bringing them out on top of the ballot.
Okay, so Jamal, answer this riddle for me then. We see that enthusiasm gap which favors the Democrats, and yet poll after poll shows us how unpopular the Democratic Party is as well. Even amongst Democrats, they're not happy with the party at the moment. So how do you square those two things?
Because every major institution in American life is unpopular right now, especially the two major political parties, but also because Democrats have what you guys can relate to. When the home sports team is losing, even the fans are mad at the team. And so if you ever listen to sports talk radio, the folks calling in are often the biggest fans of the team. They're the ones who are the most ticked off. And I think Democrats right now suffer from being disdained by the right for all the obvious reasons. Their own enthusiasts are mad at them for losing to Trump in the first place, or second place, I should add. And then you've got the broader swath of independent voters who are uneasy about Democrats because of the Biden-Harris experience and because of just not trusting them on a lot of policy issues. It doesn't leave a lot of positive sentiment around the political spectrum. But what matters in midterms is more negative energy than positive energy. And the party that can rally people against the opposition is the party that typically wins. We saw it in 2018, and I think it's taking place here again. That said, Democrats can't be so unpopular and so dreaded that people are going to be uneasy about showing up at all and say a pox on both houses. But that is the gift that keeps on giving, guys, that is Donald Trump. He's just enough to get folks to show up and vote reluctantly, but vote for Democrats.
So, Jay Martin, it looks as if Trump's idea of the Republican message, which will be picked up, I think, by the rest of the party, is they're all communists.
Yes.
It's a Red Scare message, basically.
Right.
I kind of wondered, in general, whether that has the potency that it once might have had when there was actual communism in the world.
Yes.
But that seems to be their story, and they're going to stick to it because they don't have anything else. Do Democrats have, what's the Democratic message that you can sort of boil down into, Red Scare, they're communists, or that sort of punchy, quick message?
2 words: stop Trump. Stop Trump. I mean, actually, it's one word. It says Trump, right? I mean, look, Democrats have lived off of that. He's been the organizing, the cohesive factor for Democrats for 10 years now. He's their best organizer, fundraiser, mobilizer, and unifier. What coheres a coalition, Gene, that ranges from the Cheneys to Bernie Sanders and AOC? Well, it's one thing. It's not ideological fission. It's we're against the Trump project in America. And I think Democrats are going to rely on that playbook one more time. And actually, maybe not one more time. I think they're going to keep trying to run against Trump for as long as they can. And by the way, for good reason. He is the biggest driver in American politics, certainly at his party and perhaps even around the world. So it makes sense that that would be the message. It's unifying. It tends to work. And I think that's what they're going to do. Now, on the sort of communist side, just saying that the Dems are communists, it reminds me of an adage a lot of us know from covering campaigns, which is when campaigns don't have an obvious message, they tend to live off the land. Whatever their opponents give them on a given day or a week, they seize on. And I think that's what the GOP is doing now. They don't have an agenda for Trump's final 2 years. They don't have much to run on from the last 2 years, except the tax bill. And so they're just living off the land. What is giving? What's on offer? And what's on offer is, oh my gosh, some DSA candidates won primaries. The mayor of the biggest city in the country is a socialist. Well, obviously, we're going to grab that, plug and play, and run against them as communists.
Yeah, and at least so far, there's no sign that that's working. And certainly the Republicans not presenting any actual ideas, any concepts to making people's lives better. We just saw in that poll even that one of Trump's signature issues, immigration, that poll, Democrats are favored, and especially we've seen these acts of violence as ICE operations have ramped up in American cities in recent weeks. But David Drucker, you say there is another side to that coin, because you've got a new opinion piece for Bloomberg titled "The U.S. Could Abolish ICE. Then what?" You wrote about it this way: "It would be political folly for the Democratic Party to fully embrace calls to abolish ICE, at least without adopting a substitute blueprint for strong immigration enforcement." That's not to say that Immigration and Customs Enforcement hasn't abused its power during President Donald Trump's second term. Abolishing ICE is a simplistic message that makes Democratic candidates easy pickings for Republicans. Failing to provide a detailed proposal for ICE's legitimate functions after the agency were to shut down only compounds that political miscalculation. It stokes lingering voter suspicions that Democrats don't have a problem with ICE, but with the enforcement of U.S. immigration law more broadly. And I think this is tricky because I think, David, we've seen ICE very unpopular right now, and we have seen a real abuse of its power in tragic ways a number of times this year. But Americans do want strong immigration enforcement. Polls show that. They do want the border being closed. That still remains popular. This seems like another case, though, where Democrats, in sort of that 2020 embrace of, and I'm putting this in quotes, wokeism, grabbed onto some slogans that are still being held against them.
Yeah, look, Jonathan, it's totally understandable that any American would have a problem with ICE, how the agency has functioned during Trump's second term. But, this is part of the problem is American politics keeps ping-ponging between extremes, right? So, coming out of the first Trump administration, there was a backlash to enforcement more broadly because of how it appeared Trump was handling enforcement back then. And you end up with 3 years of the Biden administration with lax enforcement at the border, and voters didn't like the chaos. They didn't like the crime that they believed came from that. They didn't like the game into the asylum system. And what does Trump do? Instead of just resetting things and fixing one problem, he goes extreme the other way. And we ended up with what we saw earlier this year in Minnesota and what we continue to see lately in Maine and Texas. And so now you have Democrats talking about abolishing ICE. And I really picked up on this a couple of weeks ago. I was in Michigan covering Abdul El-Sayed. I'm in Haley Stevens, and Mr. El-Sayed said, let's abolish ICE. And I asked him, and then do what? How do you continue enforcement? And he's like, well, we enforced immigration before ICE. We can do it after ICE. I said, how? And he didn't have an answer. And I think what, politicians tend to forget is that just because they don't like the extreme way one side is doing something, it doesn't mean they don't want anything to be done. And I think in 2026, there is so much fervor to put a check on Trump. I don't actually think Democrats have to worry about this too much in this election. But in 2028, you're going to have a presidential nominee, and voters are going to be thinking about this in a more concise way. And they're going to want to know, what's your plan for immigration enforcement? And the idea that you're going to abolish an agency without proposing a replacement, that's a problem politically. We've seen it play out in Biden after Trump, and we, in a way, have seen it play out with Trump post-Biden, in that Americans don't like extremes. They want the government to do its job, and they're not going to accept one extreme just because they didn't like the last extreme.
Senior writer at the Dispatch, David Drucker. David, thank you as always. J-Mart, to you, 2 points. First of all, I think David's right, is that anti-Trump fervor can probably carry Democrats this fall. That won't be enough. Right. That won't be enough in 2 years. There's going to have to be a positive assertive vision put forth as well. But I want to come back to you on this idea of what happened in 2020, because it does feel like we saw, that the carryover there, was rejected in 2024 on certain cultural issues, trans and the like, immigration. And it seems like even as the party has distanced itself from some of this, there's still enough of a hangover there that Republicans have been pretty good, effective, let's say, at grabbing those things and still trying to paint the whole party with them, even if that's not actually grounded in reality.
Yeah, and this has always been, John, a frustration of Democrats, that they are defined by a fairly small faction of their entire party. You hear this lamentation all the time. And there's truth to that. That in the absence of their own vision, the Republicans have done a good job of saying, maybe you don't like Trump, you don't like the conduct, but look, here's the alternative, and these guys are pretty far out there. This is not your father's Democratic Party. That's a pretty compelling message for some folks in the center of American politics. Certainly it was in 2024. I think it's less effective when Trump is in office and he is so central and his conduct is what drives every news cycle. But certainly that message is coming back in 2028, which is, you don't love us, but effectively, you can't afford the other guys. They're too far out there. They're too extreme. And John, I'll just end with this. The Democrats haven't come to terms with what they're for because they haven't reconciled a lot of these cultural issues because they want to be sensitive to marginalized communities, but at the same time, they don't want to be seen as extreme. This is a recurring challenge for them. They haven't figured it out yet. I'm not sure that they're going to by 2028. And the question in 28 is, how much can they live off of the fumes of one last anti-Trump campaign? And say, maybe he's not in the ballot this time, but his legacy is. And this is like Hoover, and you got to vote against Trump one last time. Because they certainly are much more comfortable on that terrain than putting forward their own agenda, let alone come to terms with a lot of these cultural issues.
Yeah, these are the exact debates that are going on with inside Democratic headquarters and the potential candidates' campaigns for 2028. Politico's Jonathan Martin, always a treat. J. Martin, thank you so much. Still ahead here on Morning Joe, the Trump administration signed a landmark nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia. We're going to break down that agreement and the fears surrounding its possible weaponization. Plus, we're going to bring you some brand new reporting on how CIA Director John Ratcliffe plays into the president's claim that U.S. spy agencies conspired against him in the 2020 election that he lost. Also, a top House Republican is referring Jack Smith to the Department of Justice for a criminal investigation. We're going to go over the accusations being made against the former special counsel. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Over a period of years, starting during the 2020 election cycle, the People's Republic of China carried out what is believed to be the largest compromise of election data in history, resulting in China's illicit acquisition of 220 million U.S. voter files. The second set of documents we are releasing reveals that members of the deep state, very, very famous group of people, in many cases, in our intelligence agency work to actively suppress and downplay information about the extent of China's sinister election meddling.
That was President Trump in his primetime address last week, accusing U.S. intelligence agencies of conspiring to hide China's alleged interference in the 2020 election that Trump lost. Let's bring in MS Now senior national security reporter David Rode, who's out this morning with a new piece about how Trump's claim now has put one of his most trusted aides, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, in an awkward position because, David, in Trump's first term, John Ratcliffe had a different post.
Correct. So the president, he's giving this speech, and John Ratcliffe is one of the people sitting right in front of him. And he went on to say that I didn't get briefed on any of this information in 2020. Who was one of the people deciding what was briefed to the president? John Ratcliffe, the then director of national intelligence. So was John Ratcliffe part of the deep state plot, or was he so bad at his job that he didn't know that the president was being tricked? And the reality is, the claims are false. There was no deep state plot, and there was no, Chinese effort. I want people may be confused, but interfering in the election in intelligence terms means changing votes, changing the outcome somehow. That's not what China tried to do. China tried to influence the election. John Ratcliffe did say he thought that the Chinese public effort putting out propaganda, these include like government statements, but also stuff online, was larger than other intelligence officials thought. But I just want to go back that nothing in that speech, nothing in those documents showed that there was any change in votes to change the outcome of the 2020 election. So I did this story about Ratcliffe, and there are former CIA officials who are frustrated that he just sat there through this whole speech, essentially where Trump is accusing the CIA and other intelligence agencies of being part of a deep state plot. And he's leading these agencies. And I heard some people defend Ratcliffe also that he cares about the CIA workforce. He's basically better than other cabinet members who disdain their workforces, that Ratcliffe at least values the importance of intelligence.
So maybe the 2020 John Ratcliffe was part of the deep state, but the 2026 John Ratcliffe was able to escape its clutches. But let's go back to the broader point, because we were talking about this earlier today, too. I mean, the whole speech last week, it was nonsense. There was no new evidence shown here, and some of the documents they released actually underscored the idea that Russia in 2016 tried to play an active role, in that case, of course, helping Trump. But it does seem to be setting up some sort of pretext for this November casting doubt.
And that's the real concern. And then the other thing I learned was that there was division in the White House about the speech. So there was a push, according to one senior administration official, to redact some of the information in these documents, reveal those things. And Ratcliffe pushed back and said, hey. And people at the CIA were very upset, like, do not redact this information. We cross that stuff out because we don't want sources and methods of intelligence gathering made public. Essentially, you can get people killed. And it was John Solomon and Bill Pulte who were pushing this. All senior White House officials, I was told, pushed back and agreed with Ratcliffe. And that essentially, and so no redactions were made in the documents. And you'd sort of have a dynamic where you have a group in the White House who's trying to say, we were thoughtful, we were careful, at least in terms of revealing information that could get people killed. And then it was Solomon and Pulte who were making this push to redact some information. Solomon is denying that flat out. Stephen Chung, a White House spokesperson, denied that as well. Pulte's spokesperson didn't reply, but there were some divisions before the speech.
And Caddy, it is a moment, though, where Ratcliffe, you know, it has been deemed by some observers as one of the few adults still around this president this time around in a administration that is deliberately stocked with yes men, people who are simply going to be true believers and carry out his orders, that he, at least at times, has attempted to be something of a moderating force, though put in an awkward position in the last few days.
Yeah, and some of the argument for Ratcliffe is a little bit like the argument for Todd Blanche. Imagine who it could be if it wasn't John Ratcliffe. So let's address another issue, David, because as the U.S. war with Iran is playing out, the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen say that they've carried out missile and drone attacks on 2 Saudi oil tankers in the Red Sea. These are the first claimed attacks since the Yemeni group announced a blockade on Saudi Arabia. Saudi officials confirmed one strike, saying this tanker caught fire, in fact, but stopped short of naming who was responsible and didn't comment on the second ship. The Houthis say that both vessels violated the blockade, and they say they are also forced several other ships to turn around, but those claims haven't been independently verified. Analysts say the attacks could further disrupt global oil supplies while increasing the risk of a wider regional conflict. All of this comes as the United States and Saudi Arabia yesterday formally signed a nuclear agreement that could potentially provide the kingdom with uranium enrichment capability for its civilian nuclear program. Trump administration officials were quick to defend the deal, with Energy Secretary Chris Wright saying these agreements uphold the highest standards of nuclear safety and non-proliferation, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio adding that the U.S. is not going to reach any agreement with any country in the world that leads to the risk of proliferation. Others are more skeptical, some experts warning it could open the door to possible weaponization, something Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has suggested he could pursue if Iran obtains its own nuclear weapons. So the deal is expected to last 30 years. It'll involve U.S. firms in developing the program. It's going to be submitted for review to Congress, where it will likely be met with some opposition, but would require a veto-proof majority to override it. But, Gene, 2 questions. What is the U.S. getting in return? Because this has been mooted for a long time, that we would help the Saudis with their civilian uranium enrichment, and in return they would normalize relations with Israel. That's what the Biden administration was trying to work on. That doesn't seem to have happened, so I don't know what we're getting. And the second is, how do we make sure that if the Saudis are in control of their own enrichment, it doesn't lead to some kind of nuclear proliferation? Because, as they've said, if Iran gets a bomb, we want one too.
Well, exactly. And remember, how did the Iranian nuclear program start in the first place? It was Atoms for Peace. It was the U.S. helping Iran under the Shah establish a nuclear program, which then evolved and under the Islamic government became more covert. But by then it was already really big, and they had the basics for doing uranium enrichment, and here we are. And again, it seems like the last thing we need is more uranium enrichment in the Persian Gulf, yet that's what we have signed up to encourage. So, David Rohde, how does this make sense? Make this make sense for me, and explain what we do get in return, if anything.
So it doesn't make any sense. There is an alternative. This is a badly structured deal that could lead Saudi Arabia to enrich uranium and create a nuclear bomb. Right next door to Saudi Arabia is a separate it's a civilian nuclear program in the United Arab Emirates. It was a deal negotiated by the Biden administration, and the UAE has no way to enrich uranium. It's very simple. They get enriched uranium is delivered to their nuclear power plants from other countries, from Russia. Some possibly could, I'm not sure if some comes from the United States or not, but that's a simple way to do this where there is no need for the UAE to have any way to enrich uranium, which if it could lead to a bomb. So why would the Trump administration agree that Saudi Arabia, Prince Buzzsaw, as he's called, and that's a reference to the fact that MBS, ordered the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was dismembered. And given Saudi Arabia's long record of human rights abuses, and also they haven't been the closest ally in this war, why make this deal? Why does Saudi Arabia get this special treatment? And one suggestion is that it has to do, and maybe this isn't fair, but that the Saudi Public Investment Fund invested $2 billion in the president's son-in-law's firm. That occurred soon after Jared Kushner left the first Trump administration. And there are American companies who get business from this deal. But it's, again, this sort of, frankly, just bad, incompetent policy. So maybe there's a short-term gain from some American companies, but you're now creating a situation where Saudi Arabia gets to enrich uranium that could lead it to a nuclear bomb. And this is going to upset, lastly, Israelis. They don't want to see Saudi Arabia having this ability.
Yeah, you're exactly right on that. And they'll certainly be greeted with some skepticism on the Hill, but unclear if there'll be enough to actually overturn this deal. David Rhodes, stay with us, because in a moment we're going to get your take on the new accusations being made against Jack Smith. Why a top House Republican is referring the former special counsel to the Justice Department for a criminal investigation. We'll explain that ahead here on Morning. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan has referred former special counsel Jack Smith to the Department of Justice for a potential criminal investigation, accusing Smith of intentionally making false statements to Congress last year. The Ohio Republican yesterday sent a letter to Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, claiming there is, quote, strong evidence that Smith made willfully and intentionally false statements in a closed-door deposition last December. Specifically, Jordan pointed to Smith's answers to questions about whether prosecutors obtained phone records of members of Congress during his investigation into efforts to overturn the 2020 election. During the deposition, Smith testified that he did not seek search warrants for the contents of any text messages from members of Congress during his probe and only sought toll records. But Jordan noted in his letter that documents produced this month by the DOJ shows Smith's team obtained text messages from 44 lawmakers. Smith's attorney responded by calling the referral meritless and based on a spurious claim. A congressional criminal referral is a non-binding request asking the DOJ to investigate whether someone has violated federal law and to determine whether further action is needed. The DOJ is not required to pursue charges or even open an investigation, though one suspects, David Rhodes, they very well may in this era of retribution that's been ordered from the White House. But this, to me, frankly, fits into something we were talking about a few minutes ago, that reviving the storyline now about 2020, again, an election Donald Trump lost, but it's to sort of like just make things murky, to point to the deep state, to fuel suspicions that there may be, some government meddling in the next election.
Yes, it's all a messaging effort, and I think frankly, the president himself and his team is very effective at this, and it is to just sow confusion. Why now? You've had years to look at Jack Smith, and this is why. And so, one of the broader issues here, is do you have a attorney general who will bring a very thin case? And I think that's very clear with Todd Blanche. They will. There was supposed to be possible perjury charges against other enemies of Trump. Those haven't, led to actual convictions or anything like that. It was a look at as a possibility against Jim Comey. And I just want to note, just broadly speaking, how different, again, the cabinet members are in this term. General Mattis, who was the defense secretary, resigned in the first term because Trump wanted to pull all U.S. troops out of Syria. At that point, he thought it was a grave mistake in terms of national security. ISIS was based there. Gina Haspel threatened to resign when the president tried to put Kash Patel in as the director of the CIA. Trump backed off and she remained. And then most importantly, and I'll say it, most courageously, Attorney General Bill Barr announced there was no evidence that the 2020 election had been stolen and subsequently resigned after a shouting match with Trump in the Oval Office. And that's people standing up for, I believe, our Constitution and our democracy.
And we have seen very little of that in this second term. MS Now senior national security reporter David Rowe. David, thank you as always. Coming up here on Morning Joe, we're going to take a look at a new documentary offering a diverse glimpse into people's lives across the country and how they define today's American dream. The documentary's producer and narrator, David McCourt, and contributor in the film, Sophia Bush. They'll join us next for a preview that's straight ahead here on Morning Joe.
Skirmish we have going on. I call it a skirmish. This is with this skirmish we have with the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I call it that because, let me tell you, they're getting hit so hard, and they want to make a deal. But I say they're not ready to make a deal.
That so-called skirmish is deepening by the day as U.S. troops and our allies are increasingly under fire. We're going to bring you the latest developments in that fighting with Iran in just a moment. Good morning and welcome to Morning Joe. It's Thursday, July 23rd. I'm Jonathan Lemire, and I'm thankful that you're all with us this morning. To kick us off, we have co-host of The Rest is Politics podcast, the BBC's Katty Kay. MS Now national affairs analyst John Heilman. He's also partner and chief political columnist at Puck. And we have contributing writer to The Atlantic, Eugene Robinson. My thanks to all of you this morning. We'll have more on Iran in just a little bit, but we're going to start this morning with some new polling from Fox News, which shows which political party Americans trust more to handle key issues. And voters are saying that Democrats are doing a better job on income inequality, health care, inflation, the economy, and foreign policy. Republicans hold some advantages on crime and national security, although even there, it is closely divided. And get this, when it comes to immigration, the GOP had an 8-point edge just a few months ago. But today, Democrats are preferred. 76%, meanwhile, of those polled see the economy as only fair or even poor, while just 24% say it's excellent or good. Meanwhile, 68% of Democrats say they are extremely motivated to vote in November's midterms. That's an 11-point edge on the percentage of Republicans who say the same. So John Heilman, as it was actually put on Fox News yesterday, I believe Brit Hume, the commentator, when going through some of these poll numbers, said something along the lines of like, well, there's not really much in the way of good news for Republicans in there. Yeah. And I think we can agree with Brit on that. Immigration, of course, was Trump's signature issue when he came back to the White House. He's underwater there. Democrats are preferred. And then the economy. He was elected to fix this economy, to bring down prices, to bring down inflation. And none of that has happened. And these are, as we put them on the screen here, these are really rough numbers. Because we're in late July now. It's no longer early. The midterms are on the horizon.
Jonathan, it's interesting because if you go back and look at the Joe Biden presidency, there was the moment after the kind of botched withdrawal from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and you saw at that point it was all just a linear descent for Joe Biden's numbers across the board, particularly foreign policy and also in terms of his approval rating. You can see this with Trump. If you look at those numbers are not outside. They're not like a sort of shock numbers. The reality is if you look at the polling trends, essentially going back to last summer around the time when the Epstein files started to become central to Trump's administration, you've seen Trump basically descending on every issue from his strongest issues to his weakest issues. And so we are now, I'm not sure we've got as low as we can go on some of these numbers, but the numbers on the economy, the numbers on immigration, the numbers on crime, those are all, were all either issues that he won re-election on in the case of the economy and on immigration and crime that have been his traditional strong points, and he's been not just declining but underwater really for almost a year now, or in some cases a little more than a year. On all of them, I've not seen the crosstabs in this poll on. We saw what Republicans and Democrats think there. I'd be interested to see if the Fox News poll also breaks out the number for independents, because I think those numbers would be just as daunting. There is, I'll agree with Brit Hume just this once. There's not a silver lining around any of these clouds.
No, and Katty, what's so puzzling is how little it appears that Trump and Republicans are doing to correct this. He still mocks affordability. There's still not much in the way of an economic agenda to turn things around. His aides can barely get him out on the road to talk about this. Obviously, the war has picked back up, which is leading to an increase in fuel prices. And we see on immigration as well a return in recent weeks to these heavy-handed tactics that led to, tragedy back in Minneapolis earlier this year, but also a further collapse in his poll numbers. And now we're seeing these violent incidents again.
Yeah, and those stories getting back in the headlines. Another story coming out of Florida of somebody who was here on a tourist visa who was being chased by ICE, tried to get away and then was shot as well. So there are going to be more of those headlines as well. But I think the remarkable thing, Eugene, is how little the president is doing to try to help the party. I mean, even last night in Georgia, when he mocks the idea of affordability and says this is a Democratic invention, this whole word is a Democratic invention, and then calls the Iran war a skirmish at a time where clearly and says tells journalists this is a war that is incredibly popular when we have a poll showing that it's only got 29% approval ratings. He's just not helping his party.
Right. It's almost as if Donald Trump doesn't really care about the party or anybody else and only cares about himself, right?
Wow.
He actually did one thing. The numbers that I think the Republican Party are perhaps, or they should be really concerned about, are those enthusiasm numbers. Who's really motivated to vote? With an 11-point gap, Democrats ahead by 11 points. And I think that's why the new Republican theme is pointing at Democrats and saying they're all communists. They're all commies. They're trying to generate a new Red Scare. And, in Georgia yesterday, President Trump did do that. But then he kind of took it back with the way he talked about Iran and the way he talked about affordability, which he makes fun of. And that's a very, very odd choice, to make fun of the very concept of affordability when, in fact, it's a huge issue in the lives of most Americans.
So, John Hyman, you asked about crosstabs. We deliver crosstabs. Here's an important one. From that poll that we've been talking about, 54% of those surveyed expect the economy to worsen in the coming year. Only Republicans expressed some optimism, 71% things could get better, while Democrats, 75%, and here's the key, 64% of independents expect it to get worse.
Yeah, those numbers are obviously brutal. We have so much partisan polarization that the overall number matters a lot. The number with Republicans, actually, surprisingly, for Trump, by historic standards, seeing only 71% among Republicans.
He's usually in the upper 80s.
He's in the upper 80s. That's a bad sign for Donald Trump in terms of enthusiasm in the base, and we saw that in the earlier numbers you put up about how eger Democrats are to get out and vote this November. But those independent numbers in a midterm election, those are just brutal numbers to be underwater. They have 2/3 basically on that question, and I'm betting that's going to be a kind of a consistent finding. It's going to be Democrats rate the president worse on most of these issues, and independents are not that much far behind partisan Democrats in terms of how they view President Trump's handling. And Republicans are now so firmly tied to the hip to Donald Trump that there's really the thing that makes the situation so daunting for so many of these Republicans in battleground states, whether it's the Senate or battleground districts in the House, is that they have given up so much of their authority to Trump and bound themselves to him. They are his instrument. And so it's very hard now to do what a lot of candidates who are in vulnerable positions would normally do in a time like this, which is put some distance between themselves and the White House. These Republicans not only don't want to do that because they're afraid of Trump, but they can't do that because they are just inextricably bound up with what he's done.
Yeah, you see sometimes a lame duck president, a second-term president, there's the ability to do that.
He'll start running away.
But not, especially in a popular one.
Yeah.
But there's no case here. And we're going to have more on the show later about Democrat concerns that the White House and the administration may try to put their thumb on the scale for this November's midterms. But the consensus among both parties, honestly, is if things are done free and fairly. I mean, Democrats are heavily favored to take the House. The Senate, a toss-up, but the Ds are growing more optimistic by the day, in part because of numbers just like this. That Americans are unhappy with the direction the country's going, and there's no sign that Trump and Republicans are doing anything to fix it. And that includes bringing this war to any kind of conclusion. And it is a war, not a skirmish. The United States and Iran traded strikes last night for the 12th straight night. as the two sides continue to ramp up both the fighting and the rhetoric. The president yesterday reiterated his threat to target civilian infrastructure in Iran, which would likely amount to a war crime if realized. Trump warned on Truth Social that anytime Iran, quote, shoots at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, then the U.S. will bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant even in or near the capital of Tehran. Iran's foreign minister responded to Trump's threat, writing, "Our defense doctrine is clear, eye for an eye. Any aggression against Iran, including our infrastructure, will compel a powerful and decisive response." Meanwhile, the fighting is continuing, with the U.S. military saying its strikes are centered on degrading Iran's ability to threaten shipping in the Strait, despite the president making this claim yesterday at a rally in Georgia.
If you combine us and Venezuela, we have about 62% of the world's oil market. So we don't need straits. We don't need anything. We don't need the Hormuz Strait, but we do it because we have to do it, because we cannot let Iran have a nuclear weapon.
Okay, let's fact check the president. We're going to be doing a lot of that this morning. We do need, the global economy needs the Strait of Hormuz. Now, there are efforts underway to reduce the energy sector's reliance on the Strait of Hormuz, but alternatives constructed in the region could be years in the making. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz is an absolutely vital waterway, and Iran has proven they can kind of open and close it at will. And that is, at least for now, one of the legacies of this conflict. That waterway was open to all back in February, and now it is under Tehran's thumb.
Yeah, negotiations are about two big things, remember. They're about Iran's nuclear programs, and they are now about the Strait of Hormuz, which they weren't before because the Strait of Hormuz is open. Add to that, we now have threats against the Red Sea as well, which is another area of transport for both energy and other supplies going out through the Suez Canal. So that's now under attack as well. But when it comes to the mounting toll of the war, a new count compiled by an independent conflict monitor and shared with MS Now documents 21 strikes on bridges, railways and water facilities across Iran in July, although U.S. officials deny targeting civilian sites intentionally. For more, let's bring in MS Now White House reporter Akayla Gardner. Akayla, thanks very much for joining us here. This has been something that Donald Trump keeps threatening. Yeah. It borders into the area of war crimes if he goes after civilian sites. What do we actually know about what the White House is doing in this area?
Something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about is in January, President Trump promised the Iranian people to come to their rescue. On the first day of the strikes of this war, he said that the U.S. was coming to help the Iranian people. And now we have consistently seen him basically threatened to destroy their entire civilization. He's talked about bombing them back to the Stone Ages, back to oblivion. And now he repeatedly talks about targeting civilian infrastructure. And what this data shows, and I want to say this independent monitor, it's one of the most respected monitors in the world. It's frequently cited by the UN and the World Bank. It shows that there have been strikes on civilian infrastructure. And as we mentioned, it's bridges, it's water facilities, it's railways. I spoke to one Iranian American who has family along the coast of the Strait of Hormuz, who says her family cannot evacuate if needed because all of the major roads and bridges are destroyed. So these are having real impacts. There's also a report that there was a drinking water system that potentially cut off supplies to thousands of people and 20 villages. And the administration has not been transparent. They dispute at least one of these incidents that ACLED is talking about here, but they have not been transparent about what exactly is happening.
Akayla, does the administration, how do they deal with the question of whether or not this is in fact a war crime? That they're going after civilian targets that are not legitimate targets.
Yeah, a U.S. official told us that they do not target these places intentionally, but what administration officials have argued is that some of these targets are dual-use targets, so they're used by both the military and civilians. But when you're talking about targets that have to do with food or agriculture or water, it's very difficult to make that argument that there's an overwhelming need for these places to be struck, and it raises questions about whether we're being precise in our strikes.
Coming up, we'll bring you a special roundtable discussion on the state of the American economy. Joe will run through the key issues facing voters right now, from inflation and home prices to a potential bubble on Wall Street. That conversation is straight ahead here on Morning Joe.